Good afternoon. And good afternoon to all of you joining us. So, real quick summary. Tell me the 9 steps.
Pray.
Pray.
Read 5 chapters before and after the story.
Okay.
Figure out the boundaries of the story.
Okay.
Figure out who the main characters are.
Okay.
Figure out the arrangement.
Okay.
And ask the focusing questions.
Good.
And then figure out the ECI.
Okay.
Then go from ECI to TCI to LCI.
Okay.
And then connect from the Israelites' time to now.
Okay. Good job. Those are the 9 steps. And for homework, you were supposed to work on chapter 8, right? So steps 1 through 7, correct? Okay. So I assume that you prayed. Okay. So tell me, how does chapter 8 relate to the surrounding chapters?
Well, the Israelites are already turning away from God after they just repented in chapter 7.
Okay. They're turning away from God and wanting a king to rule over them, right? In chapter 8. Right. Okay. How else does it connect?
I'm not sure.
Okay. In reading your 5 chapters after, you read chapter 12, right?
Yep.
Okay. Chapter 12 begins with, "And Samuel said to all Israel, Behold, I have obeyed your voice and all that you have said to me, and made a king over you." So he's connecting it right back to chapter 8, where he says, in chapter 8, they asked for a king. So in chapter 12, he's connecting it back to chapter 8, where they asked for a king. And the end of chapter 12 says in verse 23, "Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you, and I will instruct you in the good and the right way. Only fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king." And he's talking about them asking for a king in that chapter. Okay, what else?
I didn't notice anything else.
Well, you did yesterday. You mentioned that in verse 2, or actually in verse 3, Samuel's sons do not walk in his ways, but turn aside after gain, as like Hophni and Phinehas, right? In earlier chapters. Good. We also mentioned that in chapter 7, you have the summary of Samuel's life and ministry, because in chapter 8 now, the people are going to ask for a king and are turning away from following Samuel, letting Samuel be their judge, right? Okay. So then in chapter 9 and 10, what happens?
Saul is anointed and chosen as king.
Okay.
And yeah.
Okay. So you see how 9 and 10 connect. In chapter 8, they ask for a king. Chapter 9 and 10, the king gets chosen. Right? Okay. Good. Next step, identify the boundaries of this story and also the major sections of the story.
Well, it starts in verse 1 and ends in verse 22, I think.
Okay. And give me the background, crisis, resolution, conclusion.
Well, the background is verse 1 through 3.
Okay.
And I hate to say it, I couldn't figure out what the crisis was.
Okay. Okay, well, let's work on that. Where does the action begin?
Verse 4.
Okay. And where does it conclude?
Verse 23, which is non-existent.
No, no. in verse 22, Samuel said to the men of Israel, "Go every man to his city." What's that indicate?
The end of the story.
A conclusion, right? Okay. So you have the resolution, usually part of the conclusion or just a little bit before that. What would the resolution be?
Verse 19 through 21. Or something.
I would say verse 21 is the resolution. Verses 19 and 20, I would say, are the climax. So if you follow, here's what's happening. The crisis begins with the elders gather together and tell Samuel, "You're old, your sons don't follow you, give us a king." Samuel goes to God and says, "They want a king." God says, "They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. You can give them a king, but tell them what the king is going to do to them." And so then you have a long speech where Samuel warns them, this is what a king will be like. And then you have in verse 19, but the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. So was Samuel just saying, this is what a king is going to be like? Or what was he doing there with that speech?
He was warning them.
He was warning them, saying, are you absolutely sure this is what you want?
Probably more like, don't choose this. This is how it's going to be.
This is a bad option, fellows. Right. But verse 19, he finishes his speech and you're waiting for what are the people going to do in response to this big speech? And the climax, the people refuse to obey the voice of Samuel. So that is the pinnacle of the crisis. They refused to listen to Samuel and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us that we may be like all the other nations. So, now, having explained the crisis to you, what is the crisis about?
The Israelites disobeying God and wanting a king.
Yeah, the crisis is about the Israelites wanting a king. And will they insist on a king or will they be content to follow God? That's the crisis. Okay, let's go to main characters. Who are the main characters here?
Samuel. And the Israelites.
And the Israelites. Yeah, and then of course you have God. And so who would be the protagonist?
Samuel.
That's a tough one in this story. Let's put it this way. What's the antagonist?
The Israelites.
Let's come back to the crisis. What is the crisis about?
The Israelites wanting a king.
The Israelites wanting a king. Now, is this a problem for Samuel?
Partly.
Kind of, sort of, not really. The focus is not so much on Samuel. The focus is on the demands of the people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, the antagonist is more of a situation where the people want a judge or ruler, well, who's going to rule over the people? There's a situation that the people need resolved. Who is going to lead them? That's the situation, the problem situation. So, in that case, who's the protagonist?
The Israelites?
The Israelites. So this story is actually about the Israelites.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on from the main characters, you then have arrangement. How is this story arranged? Anything specific about the arrangement that you noticed?
Takes kind of a long time for God to talk in verse 7 through 9.
Okay. And there's an even longer speech.
10 through 18.
10 through 18. Right. Given by Samuel.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So ordinarily you would think that Samuel is the main character, the protagonist, but he's not the one that's having to make a decision. Do you understand? He is God's spokesperson, but he's not the one having to make a decision. Samuel is the only one named. Samuel has the longest speech in the story, so ordinarily you would think that he is the main character that has to make the decision that the story is all about. But the story is not about Samuel, is it? The story is about the people of Israel wanting a king, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you would put them as the protagonist. Like I said, it's a tougher one. 10 through 18 is a long speech by Samuel, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in that, he's describing what the king will do.
Yeah. And also, I noticed that the phrase, like all the nations, was repeated.
Good. Like all the nations. Right. So, where did you see that repeated?
Verse 5 and verse 20.
Good. Good. They wanted to be like the nations. They didn't want to be different. They wanted to be like them. They wanted to have a king who would rule over them and judge them like the nations. Good. What about focusing questions?
Well, I think the nature of God is to sometimes give his people what they want, even if it's wrong.
Okay.
And the human nature is the Israelites turn away from God easily. Oh, wait. They turn away from God easily.
Okay, so again, you took the human nature from the Israelites, which again shows that they are the protagonists. So, yes, they turn away from God easily. You could also say something more about the human nature there. What was this an issue over?
Whether God would be their leader or a human.
Right, whether they would let God be their king or whether they would have a human king. Because God says in verse 7, the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." So, the question is, who is going to be their king, God or a human? That's the question in front of them. Moving on from the focusing questions, now to the ECI. What did you come up with?
The Israelites turn away from God easily, but he sometimes gives us bad things.
Okay. Okay, now you said sometimes gives us bad things. We're not talking about us in the ECI. We're still talking about the Israelites. So the Israelites turned away from God, and God gave them what they wanted. Right? Mm-hmm. That's basically what you were saying, right? Okay, good. Now, today, we're going to look more at the focusing questions. There's several focusing questions that will help us dig deeper into the story and kind of narrow it down so that we can come up with the ECI. Okay? First question. How is the crisis facing the main character seen in our lives? So what's the crisis facing the main characters? Who's the main character?
The Israelites.
Israelites. What's the crisis?
Whether or not they're going to choose, whether they're going to have God or a human for their king.
Okay, so it's a question of who will they have ruling over them, right? How does that show up in our lives? Now, we're starting to connect a little bit, but I'm just trying to help us think a little bit here. How does this story show up in our lives? This sort of thing.
Well, we can let God rule our lives or try to rule it ourselves.
Okay. Yeah, we face the same sort of question. Who are we going to submit to? Right? Okay, next. The crisis of a story often creates a theological test. TT for short. The main character must trust or obey God in some way. What is the theological test of the story? So, who's the main character?
The Israelites.
The Israelites. Okay. The crisis is who is going to lead them, creates a theological test. Now you state this theological test as a question.
Who will lead them?
Who will the Israelites follow? Or will the Israelites accept God as their king or insist on a human king? Or you could state it a little bit, change the focus just a little bit. Will the Israelites repent of seeking a human king and return to following God? Because that's what Samuel's whole statement is about. His whole speech is about. There's a warning. Don't go this way. And so he finishes his speech, and like I said, the climax is, what are the people going to do? And it says, but the people refuse to obey the voice of Samuel. So the question is, the theological test, will the Israelites listen to Samuel and give up the idea of a human king and instead follow God as their king? So you can narrow it down to, will the Israelites continue to accept God as their king? That is the question. Then again, we're starting to relate it to us now. We're starting to think about how we're crossing this bridge. How is this theological test seen in our lives today?
Will we follow God or and do what he wants us to do, or just do what we want to do?
Or follow our own choices. Right. Good. Next question. What does the passage show us about human nature? We already talked about that, right? Human nature is we want
to do what we want.
Okay, and how is this aspect of human nature seen in our lives again? How is this aspect of human nature seen in our lives today? Again, we are looking at how are we going to cross this bridge, right? So,
we want to do what we want.
We want to do what we want. Good. What does the passage show us about God?
He sometimes gives his people what they want, even when it's not right.
Okay. He gives them what they want. He lets them choose their way. Let's put it that way. And how does this aspect of God show up today?
He still lets us choose our own way.
Yeah, think about how humble God is. Here he was, king over Israel. He had called them to be his people. He had brought them out of Egypt. He had ruled over them. He had given them the law. He had sent them judges. Every time they repented, he helped them. And now they come and they say, we don't want you as king. We want a human king. And God does not say, tough, you've got me, deal with it. He doesn't do that. He says, let them have their way. How is the story shaped by the Mosaic covenant? Many stories in the Old Testament which take place after the Mosaic covenant are directly impacted by that covenant, meaning that there are details emphasized or events that take place that find their root in the law of Moses, especially the book of Deuteronomy. So how is this story impacted by the Mosaic covenant?
Wasn't there something about choosing a king in the Mosaic covenant?
Mm-hmm. There was. Turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14. It says, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it, and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. Oh, where have we heard that phrase before? See, the writer of 1 Samuel 8 took that phrase in verse 5. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. And then in verse 20, that we may also be like all the nations. He took that phrase and emphasized that phrase. Why? Because it is in Deuteronomy 17. And he's reflecting. He wants us, as we read 1 Samuel 8, to be thinking about Deuteronomy 17. So it says, when you go into the land, and you dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. And then it goes on to give more commands about what the king shall and shall not do. But it's interesting, in Deuteronomy 17, God gives permission for them to set up a king. But in 1 Samuel chapter 8, it's very clear that this is not pleasing to God or to Samuel. Why do you think that is? I think the clue is in verse 7. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. That was the problem. It wasn't that they wanted a king and God, it's that they wanted a king instead of God. And we're getting that hint there in this chapter, and then it's emphasized again in chapter 12. Verse 17, Samuel is talking about how they chose a king and God was not happy with it. So then verse 17, Samuel says, is it not wheat harvest today? I will call upon the Lord that he may send thunder and rain, and you shall know and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord in asking for yourselves a king. So it was wicked for them to ask for a king at this time. Apparently it was because they did not want to follow God. They did not trust God. They wanted a human king. Even though in the law there was provision for them to have a king. Next question. How does the new covenant affect the ideas in this story? The new covenant. So we're talking now New Testament. How have things changed? Who is to be our ultimate authority?
God.
God and his word. So we are free to choose the government that we want in this republic here. In the New Testament, in Romans chapter 13, we're told to obey the powers that are over us because all the powers that be are ordained of God. So government actually is from God. So it's not wrong to have different types of government, but we are to obey the government that we have. So those are just some ideas of how the new covenant would connect with this story. It doesn't change the main idea very much. Sometimes the new covenant will change the main idea quite a bit. But in this case, the new covenant doesn't change it very much. We're still to have God as the primary authority in our lives. What was the writer's purpose for writing this story? Why do you think he wrote it?
To show why the Israelites, to show how the Israelites got a king.
Okay, first of all, to show not so much how they got a king, that's chapters 9 and 10, but what made the transition from being governed by judges to governed by a king? What brought about that change? So this shows that brought about the change. Now, he could have simply said, when Samuel got old, the people requested a king, and so Samuel appointed a king for them. And that could have been background to the story of chapter 9. But now you have this whole chapter there. So what was his purpose in writing this whole chapter?
I'm not sure.
Well, come back to what we noticed was the ECI, and also the vision of God, the human nature, the TT. Think about those things and bring those into play. What is the writer focusing on? He's asking the question, will the Israelites listen to Samuel and follow God, or will they decide to have a king on their own? That's your theological test. Human nature of our lives is to want to choose our own way and not follow God. Vision of God, God is a God who lets us go our own way if we insist on it. Let me see if I can help you out here. What would be his purpose in writing this story? Well, one, it shows the transition from Israel being governed by judges to being a king. Right. But the fact that he emphasized that the people rejected God, that Samuel warned them, that people did not listen, all that. His purpose in writing the story is to warn the people about not following God, and how even the desire for a king, even though a king could be good, their desire for a king was not because they wanted someone who would help them follow God, but they wanted somebody instead of God to follow. So the writer was wanting to point out that even though the people had a king, they still needed to follow God. And he's going to bring up that point more specifically in chapter 12. Okay, then what results did the writer hope to see? Now this is related to what was his purpose. What results did the writer hope to see?
That the people would follow God.
Okay, yeah, that the people would follow God, even though they had a king. Good. So those are the focusing questions. There's quite a few, right? And it takes quite a bit of work, but those questions can only be answered after you've done the necessary work of looking carefully at the passage, seeing how it's related to all the other chapters, of looking at, okay, what is the crisis? Where is the emphasis in the story? Who is the main character? All those things have to be dealt with first before you can get to these focusing questions. But then these focusing questions really help us narrow down and cement, okay, this is what the ECI is. This is what it's all about. If we don't do that, we end up wondering, okay, do I really have the ECI or not? And then it makes it harder to progress beyond that to the TCI, LCI, and then create a proper lesson. So these focusing questions are really important, but you got to lay the groundwork first. So, homework. I want you to go back to 1 Samuel chapter 1. And I want you to work through through the 7 steps all the way up to the ECI, answering each of these things. So you're going to work in detail through how does it connect to the different chapters, who's the main characters, who's the minor characters, what's the crisis, the background crisis, resolution, conclusion, all that sort of stuff. You're going to answer the focusing questions. And you're going to make sure they all fit together and unite together. Okay?
Okay. With the before and after, am I reading Ruth too?
No. No. In this one, just go with the after.
Okay.